Well, it's a little after 2 in the morning as I record this, and it's September 2021, which is a little over 7 years, about 7 years, since I published the third of the Empire of the Wheel books, and 14 years since I started dabbling in remote viewing and stumbled upon this whole mystery. Those are interesting numbers for a variety of reasons, for me personally and relative to the Empire of the Wheel mystery. So I thought I'd just very casually chat about that in this particular, I don't know if you'd call it an episode or whatever. Let's go back. 2007 was when I, as I said, was dabbling in remote viewing and did a couple of remote viewing sessions, which led to some interesting esoteric landmarks in history in Riverside, California. And I had been involved in writing Latitude 33, my book about Disneyland, so Seshari and I were already working on telluric current, ley line, type of stuff in Southern California, had already identified the intersection in Disneyland. And if you recall, what got me eventually started on looking directly at the Empire of the Wheel stuff was following the telluric lines from that intersection in Disneyland throughout Southern California. Just kind of followed the lines that headed this way, kind of northeastward to San Bernardino area. But before that, that was in 2008. The book, if I recall, was actually released in early 2008 when I was, first stumbling into this Empire of the Wheel stuff. But before that, in the last third of 2007 was when the weirdness with the remote viewing was revealing those said landmarks and such. So Seshari and I were already curious about where these lines were leading and what it meant for the Inland Empire. When I speak of the Inland Empire, I speak of the San Bernardino Valley and over in Riverside primarily. And what really kick-started everything, I think, was stumbling upon the strange clock tower down by the city offices in downtown Riverside, close to the old court building, the one built in 1903. There's another synchronicity for you for those who pay attention to my breakaway research, the book Origin and such. And at that time, I was not aware, not at least overtly not aware, of the presence of Hecate and her role. And how that happened, very specifically, that is my awareness, was when Seshari asked me to go check out a particular location in Riverside. This was the State Citrus Historical Park. It's the citrus history. This area, the Inland Empire of Southern California, used to be the heart of the citrus industry in California. This is where the navel orange was originated for the first time in America, the United States, I should say. The parent navel orange trees that were brought here, I believe, from South America, they still stand and are alive, and they're kind of a little living arboretum style monument in Riverside. And these are the trees from which the classic California navel, American navel orange was bred from, you could say, or hybridized from, such. And so citrus was a big deal in this area. Even when I was a kid, there were a lot more. I mean, in my own lifetime, there were a lot more orange groves in this area than there are today. A lot. And the railroad, of course, was a big deal here. It always has had a large presence, but it was a big deal, particularly because the citrus industry, the railroad and the citrus industry kind of fed each other. But this was a perfect area for the railroad to have kind of a major, I guess, junction, if you will. In other words, if you were going from Southern California to anywhere else, eastward in the United States or even northward, San Bernardino was the hub for the railroad. You would come through San Bernardino. And anyway, as I said, when I was a kid, there were still a lot of orange groves, and over by the San Bernardino County Museum, where that is now, there was we call it a stand in those days. It was like a little drive up where you could get fresh squeezed orange juice. That was a thing that was here because there was so much, citrus industry here. So there were all the little spin-off businesses. And I remember that particular one. You could pull off the 10 freeway there and where Redlands meets Loma Linda. And you could get a cup of fresh squeezed orange juice, and it was amazing and wonderful and all that. And my dad, when he worked for Union Oil Company, he was a commercial salesman, so he had the big accounts like construction companies with huge fleets of giant vehicles and such. He didn't service the gas stations. His gig was more the bigger companies that used Union Oil Company product. And one of his clients that he dealt with was a sun-kissed grower. Sun-kissed being, I don't hear too much about that company now, but at one time it was big, and it was, part of life here in the Inland Empire in Southern California. And so one of the major sun-kissed growers was one of my dad's accounts. And he would, I remember during the holidays, he would come home, sometime after Thanksgiving, always with a big, full size, the full cardboard box, the fruit and vegetable boxes, just full of sun-kissed navel oranges. And these things were perfect. They were amazing. Just the best oranges you ever ate in your life. And there was a time where you picked them off the tree that perfectly. That was how good they were. So the citrus industry is a big part of the history here, and that's why there is the historical park, the citrus industry history or whatever it's called, historical park. It's in Riverside. And Seshari was telling me that there was a significant spot of telluric current over there. So this was in December of 2007, and I agreed to drive over there and check it out. I walked around. It's kind of a cool place where, it's where there's still an existing orange grove. And there's even one of those fresh squeezed orange juice stands there. It wasn't open on the day I was there, but they do have one. And they have like a kind of a visitor center When I went, that stuff wasn't open, but you could still walk around. And I walked around the park, and it was an overcast day. It was December. And at one point, shortly before I left, I found there was a little rose garden. And I sat on the bench in the rose garden. I've always liked roses. It's kind of odd. But you know, roses are kind of great flowers. And so I'm sitting there, just relaxing. And here's the funny thing. I would have to go back, dig into my notes, but off the top of my head, I can't remember why I had first stumbled upon St. Catherine of Alexandria. Yes, I do remember now. It was a remote viewing. Good Lord. It was a remote viewing. It was one of those remote viewings that I had done, and it resulted in this weird glyph, and the glyph was a butterfly shape connected to an axe blade with a wheel at the bottom. And look, I want to comment on that. I think it's very weird, very odd that at first, I'm like, oh, I can't think what brought St. Catherine to my mind, and then I remembered it was probably the most significant remote viewing I had ever done. And I don't know why that wouldn't be fresh on my mind. Maybe because it's been 14 years, and 7 years ago when I kind of walked away from the Empire of the Wheel to give myself a break. Maybe that's why it didn't come to mind. But note that, please note that initially I said I can't recall how, and then I did recall how, and it was very significant. Your mind plays games with your memory when you've encountered things like synchronicity, on steroids, as they say, which we did with this Empire of the Wheel thing, I and the few others that were involved in various degrees of investigating it with me. But this particular remote viewing, a butterfly, an axe blade, and a wheel, and so I did kind of general, searches on those terms, butterfly, axe blade, and wheel, and St. Catherine of Alexandria popped up, because breaking a butterfly on a wheel was a phrase that popped up, and it refers to the legend of this particular St. Catherine, in which we're told that she was tortured by being strapped to a wheel, which is something they used to do, and they would, I guess, spin it around or whatever and break their bones and such. And when they had her on the wheel, according to the legend, the wheel broke before they could hurt her. And then I think as it goes, I'd have to pull the book out, but they might have finally used the axe on her, if I'm not mistaken. She was in prison for a while. The head guy there in Alexandria, political or church leader or whatever, essentially, or not the king, but one of the big mucky mucks. And the reason, this was a legend. This turns out to not be true at all, okay? Which I'll get to. But I had remote viewed that, and so I had become aware of St. Catherine of Alexandria, the legend. And I immediately had recognized, when I saw the legend of her, that they had lifted the biography of Hypatia of Alexandria. Look her up, Hypatia, and you'll see what I mean. So I'm sitting there in the citrus park, and I kind of used a little method or thing that my mentor had taught me. I'm sitting there, and the Rose Garden, and my research on St. Catherine had indicated that roses are associated with her. So I'm sitting there and I say, "Okay, Catherine, show me something." I invited Catherine of Alexandria to show me something. Now, I knew that she had been one of the three entities, sainted entities, that had been communicating with and instructing Joan of Arc. In fact, St. Catherine of Alexandria was the lead, the main one. So I was already aware of the Joan of Arc connection. And so, there I was, show me something, Catherine, and nothing immediately happened. I sat there a couple more minutes, and then finally, said, I'll just get up and go home. So, I got in the car, and I'm heading back down the street, and my intention is to go to the freeway, head back home, but I reach Victoria Boulevard, and I feel the thought crosses my mind, I think I'll take the scenic route. I'll drive down Victoria Boulevard. It's one of the oldest thoroughfares in Riverside. It goes through some of the older communities, through the orange groves. But, something kind of compelled me to take Victoria Boulevard, which kind of runs parallel to the freeway anyway. So I headed there, north, I guess that would be on that. And I'm driving along, and as I'm going through, I reach this area where, there's this field, and to my right, which would be east, and there's this prominent hill, and you can see that there's houses up there and stuff, and it just struck me. It looked like something from, an old painting. And it looked like something from, it reminded me of when I was in Italy in '99 and going through, on the train in northern Italy. And, a lot of the terrain there reminds me of Southern California. And, I'm thinking of that. And I again, this thought kind of compels me. I think I'll go take a look at that. So I turn off of Victoria Boulevard and I drive over there, and it's a little community called Berkshire Hills. And now remember, I'm doing this all from memory. I don't have the Empire of the Whale book sitting in front of me. This is a casual conversation, so don't look at this as a regular report thing. In fact, you might want to, I don't know when you're listening to this, you might want to save it for late at night. This is kind of a late at night conversation. So I drive over there and I discover, it's called Berkshire Hills. And as I'm driving on the streets, I'm recognizing that the names are Native American names, but they're not West Coast or Southwest Native American names. I recognize them immediately as New England, Northeastern North American, Native American names, Pontotoc and such. So I come down out of Berkshire Hills, and it's an interesting little community. You kind of, in a way, almost feel like you're not in the Inland Empire, and I love little pockets. I've discovered a couple of pockets in various other places, one of them being San Diego. Discovered it by accident all the years I was down there. I'd never seen that pocket. And there's a pocket here between Highland and Mentone, which by now has probably been ruined with overdevelopment, But at one time, it was this wonderful little corner that I actually used in a film. But it was this interesting little pocket in this Berkshire Hills, and it had a different feel to it. So I come down off of Pontotoc, and I go down to turn right to head back to Victoria Boulevard, and as I round the corner, in the western direction, there's the quarry. What I later learned was the Prenda Quarry. And it looked very old, and it looked Lovecraftian, honestly. Just these massive, but, stone walls where clearly stone had been removed and cut away. But it just had this old feel, like from some, ancient kind of lost megalithic civilization feel to it almost. And I get out and I go look, and it's got water in the bottom of it. This is a quarry that clearly hasn't been active in decades. Okay, at the time I didn't know it was called Prenda Quarry. But as I'm standing there, I get the feeling that this is what Catherine wanted to show me. Remember, I had said, "Hey, Catherine, show me something." And I had felt like that I'd been guided to drive over and find this quarry. So as I'm standing there, the weather kind of gets a little more overcast, and I begin to feel a little tired. And so after I've had my fill of looking at this thing, I go back to my car and I start heading home. And there really wasn't much traffic. It was early enough in the afternoon that I didn't hit traffic. So we're only talking about really a 15-minute or so freeway drive, okay? And in that time that I left the quarry and arrived home, an intense ache, this intense pain and stiffening of one of my shoulders and my neck took root, and I developed a fever. I could tell I was coming down with something. I still had mobility, but it's just that achy feeling in the shoulder. And by that evening, this was a Wednesday, as I recall, and it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was the Wednesday before Christmas of that year. And that night I started doing a little more research on Catherine and such, and that was the night that I discovered that Catherine was actually Hecate, who I was only vaguely familiar with, and knew her as the dark underworld goddess of the witches' claim and all that. And I realized, my gosh, what we have here is a syncretic identity. There was no St. Catherine of Alexandria. What they had done was the church had taken Hecate and grafted her together with Hypatia of Alexandria. Okay. Because the same patrons whom St. Catherine of Alexandria watches out for are the same ones that Hecate is known to watch out for, and then the symbol of the wheel was a dead giveaway. And if I'm not mistaken, this is when I also, I was poking around, and I discovered the St. Catherine of Alexandria Church in Riverside, and there's a statue of her right out front. You can see it in the books, the Empire of the Wheel books. There's a statue right out front of her with the wheel. Essentially, that's the goddess Hecate. And I also discovered at that time that the Catholic Church admits this in one of their new Catholic encyclopedias, that Catherine of Alexandria never existed. They admit that much. They don't admit grafting her to Hecate, but it's obvious when you know who Hecate is. So by that evening, late that evening, the pain in my shoulder and neck had stiffened up my shoulder so badly that I had no, only like half range motion. And I felt like I had a fever, and I honestly felt like I was afflicted by something out at the quarry. Now, the water was like brackish and looked like it had this nasty film on it. But there was no noticeable gas or odor emanating off the thing, and I didn't get that close to the water. I wasn't like down on the edge. But, I wondered, my gosh, could I have breathed something? And it was very strange. And 2 days later, after suffering through this, I was reading, looking at the book Weird California, and there was a little bit about weird stuff associated with Mount Rubidoux over in Riverside, and I got the bright idea that I needed to go to Mount Rubidoux the next day. So this was the Saturday before Christmas. So I get up, and I shouldn't have been driving. I mean, I had not total range motion. My left shoulder and that side of my neck were just completely stiff. I had to turn my body completely around to check a lane before I got over there. But I did it. I drove over to Riverside, went over to Rubidoux, and I did the long walk on that trail up to the top. And I was in pain, just not feeling that good. But I did the walk, and I finally reached what's called the Peace Tower. Look it up. You can see it online. I talk about it in the books, of course. So I'm looking at this Peace Tower, and what I immediately notice is it seems familiar to me. The bridge overtly, because years before, well, actually, just 2 years, a little over 2 years before, I had done a couple of trips to Mostar in Bosnia, and there's a bridge there that is very similar to the one at the Peace Tower. Now, the Peace Tower itself, the bridge and the footbridge and the Peace Tower, they're based on, I subsequently learned, a very similar setup in Spain, which is kind of interesting. I talk about that in Empire of the Wheel 3, I think. So, I walk up the stone steps, I walk across the bridge, and I go to this Peace Tower thing, and it's a stone tower that I think was erected in 33 or 34, something, maybe 37, I don't know. I'd have to look at the books again, but it was the 1930s. And it was associated with Frank Miller, the guy who built the Mission Inn Hotel and such. And as I'm walking around the Peace Tower and looking at this thing, there's a window. It's very medieval, like medieval Spanish. And I put my hands up on it's stone, of course, it's a granite, and I put my hands up on the ledge and I pull myself up, excuse me, to be able to look inside. And there's a bell in there. And I'm looking around and walking around this thing, and then it dawns on me. I'm moving. I'm looking around with full range motion. I'm moving my left arm, no problem. And I realize, my God, the stiffness, it's gone. The pain is gone. I have full range motion. And I don't feel, yucky anymore. And I'm left with wondering, what the heck? Is this some more weirdness going on here? And after looking around a little bit more, I walk back down, I get in the car, come home, and it seems like what afflicted me out at the quarry was gone with that visit to the Peace Tower. So naturally, I thought, okay, a few days before, I had been at this one site, and I asked Catherine to show me something, and she, in my opinion, led me to this quarry where I was afflicted, so to speak. And then, a few days later, I'm kind of guided or suggested, you might say, to walk up Mount Rubidoux, and I come to this Peace Tower, and I'm not afflicted once I'm touching the tower and walking around the tower. So it was an affliction and a healing, and that sounds a lot like what saints are known to do. So I wondered just what the heck was going on. Now, also, you have to recall that earlier that month, I had made the San Francisco trip that I've talked about elsewhere, in which I met up with Sechery, and he showed me the telluric current spots, and that's where I had the weird experience on the one of the peaks at Twin Peaks in downtown there with the radio tower. That's where then we went over to Berkeley, and I had the strange, weird vision type experience on Indian Rock. You guys have heard me talk about that, and driving home is where I had the a word that's become popular now for this kind of thing. I was using it back then because download, but I had what ended up being the plot of my time travel novel just kind of dump into my consciousness on the drive home from San Francisco. So when you read the time travel novel, there's Empire of the Wheel, real facts and such and situations mixed in with some of the weird visionary stuff that happened to me that visit to San Francisco in December of 2007, which I think was real life. past life stuff. In I fashioned, the time travel novel out of these things. And that had happened, and also the first overt visit from a raven, crow, happened that same month. This was all before I went over to the citrus park and had this weird affliction healing experience. This was a very eventful month for this stuff. So I had that kind of month, all that weird stuff going on, and I'd had weird discoveries at an antique shop in Riverside. It was just there were. It goes back again, I think, to the remote viewing and such, and then of course simply asking Catherine to show me something. Oh boy! So then, after the holidays into 2008 is when I was following up, looking for any kind of ghost stories or reports of weird phenomenon associated with the Telluric Current that flowed out of Disneyland and out this way to the Inland Empire, and that led me to Ann Walker, the librarian who first told me about Cora Stanton, the Cora Stanton mystery, which leads me to what I intended to talk about tonight. Right now, and that was that I'm not going to go into the full details on that because I've written, Rick and I wrote the first book on that, and I wrote 2 others. But basically, Seshari, who works out the karmic frequencies and the numerology of all this stuff, he had identified Cora Stanton's personal esoteric number as 14. Now, if you recall, in the synchronicities in Empire of the Wheel, 14 was also the age of Orta Hedges, the girl in Redlands, who was the 6th victim. Now, if you recall, in 2015, when we had the weird terrorist incident here in San Bernardino, there was oodles of synchronicity. There were 14 victims. The attack happened on the very day that Orta Hedges had died 100 years, to the day. I think it was the 2nd of December, 1915. And the terrorist attack was on the 2nd of December, 2015. And if you recall, if you've read the book, published in 2011, Rick and I predicted that we expected some kind of mass murder or serial killer type murder to happen at the 100th anniversary of the Empire of the Wheel. Of course, we had 7 possible dates related to the victims, and it happened on the 100th anniversary. Again, we predicted the 100th anniversary, but in this case, it happened on the 100th anniversary of the death, murder, we think, of Orta Hedges, the 14-year-old girl. And Cora Stanton's esoteric number was also 14. There were 14 victims in 2015. This, you guys know, there's synchronicities galore with Empire of the Wheel. Also, another strange thing was there was a mall built in 1967 over where Urbita Springs Park used to be, and specifically where the lake is where the mall has sat for decades. And the south end of the lake, where Cora Stanton was found dead, floating, that became a parking lot in 1967, and I was looking through some photos I took one day of that area early on in this investigation when I realized, oh boy, the parking area, they've been renumbered since. This is what's weird. Since I started this investigation, they renumbered the numbers in the parking lot, but I have the photographs to prove that at the time I was first investigating this, the original parking lot designator, for the section where Cora Stanton had been found floating dead when it was a lake was section 14. Now, this was after Seshari, who, by the way, lives in Sacramento, never been to Inland Center, this mall, okay? He had already worked out the number 14 associated with Cora Stanton, and here this parking lot built in 1967 was shouting that at us, 14, 14, and then of course what I just explained about Orta Hedges. So, we've got that number in the mix now. I'm thinking it's been 14 years since I first stumbled into the Empire of the Wheel, as I like to put it. In fact, 14 years this time of year. I was in the middle of the remote viewing, and in September, I had just, started the remote viewings, and I was in the middle of, checking out some of the landmarks and discovering the weird stuff in the antique shop, this time 14 years ago. And I investigated the Empire of the Wheel, as my primary research project, and wrote 3 books, ultimately, over the course of 7 years. So started in 2007, stopped in 2014 with Empire of the Wheel 3. Interesting, right, that I started in 2007 and ended in 2014. There's that number. And it has been 7 years now, of course, since I wrote Empire of the Wheel 3 and kind of turned away from intense Empire of the Wheel investigation. Now, 7, of course, being a factor of 14, that's obvious, but here's another thing. Let's jump over to yet another subject, and I hope you can stay with me on this. This is just how thought trains go sometimes, right? We jump tracks. When I was taught necromancy, when I was taught how to go into a cemetery and identify a subject and work on pulling that subject up from the land of the dead and for the purpose of getting information, I was told that I would be given information in increments of 7 years. In other words, what I would ask of the dead, the spirit, to tell me about a given individual or a situation, I would be told or shown, an episode or an incident or something that, it had either occurred 7 years prior or if forward would be 7 years from the now, whenever the now was. And if, the farther, each time I went farther back, if I wanted to go farther back, it would do it in 7-year increments. So I would go from, 7 years in the past to 14 years in the past to 21 and so forth. You get the idea. There's 7, that number. And of course, 14 being in there. And I was taught how to do that in 91. Okay. So, 7 is an esoteric number. We know that. But what was really on my mind tonight is the Frank Rosasco mystery. I got into the numbers thing because I realized, my gosh, it has been 7 years since I walked away from Empire of the Wheel being my primary focus. And after a 7-year period of research starting in 2007, and it's now been 14 years ago since I stepped into that, it seemed, maybe that's why it's on my mind. But I was thinking primarily of Frank Rosasco. So I'm going to jump off the number track. Just kind of wanted to set the tone. Frank Rosasco, if you recall, was the young, I believe he was 24 years old, arrested on the train on November 30th, 1915, here in San Bernardino, a train that was bound for Barstow, and he was having a nervous breakdown. He was losing his mind. Witnesses were saying that he was hallucinating the image, the face of a woman, and he was gibbering and jabbering about somebody hurt her, something like that. And he was found clutching a woman's purse with, might have to pull the book out, I think it was $250 $32. And notice the symmetry of that 232. And add up those digits. 2 and 2 is 4. 4 and 3 is what? 7. So there's 7 for you, right? And $232. Rick worked that out in the first book. It was one of the parts of the chapters that he was, that was his part to work on, and he had pointed out, wow, $232 in 1915. That wasn't just pocket change, that was like walking around, I guess, with hundreds of dollars now in your pocket or something. But, of course, Frank Rosasco was immediately arrested on the train, taken off. He was taken over to County Hospital. He was admitted into the psychiatric ward, and he was diagnosed as being dangerously paranoid, without much specifics what dangerously paranoid in particular meant. And then, oddly enough, here we are in the middle of a murder mystery. Now, remember, on November 30th, this was 11 days after Cora Stanton was found floating dead in the lake, and she was a big mystery. And, they had suspected it was murder. And this was before Orta Hedges, turns up dead, and of course before E.P. Braid turns up dead. So they're in the middle of a season that they certainly were wondering. When you read the papers, you can see they certainly were wondering if they had a killer out there poisoning children and killing people. And so here's this guy on the train, losing his mind, and has a woman's purse and his hallucinating woman. You would think, oh my gosh, this guy could be a suspect for this mystery woman we found floating in the lake. But then a funny thing happens. If you read the book, you know this. He is released into the custody of unidentified friends from Sonora. Well, one thing, I thought that couldn't possibly be Sonora, California, right? So I did my research. I learned that Rosasco is an Italian name, and I did not find any connection to either the American Southwest or Mexico, which both have Sonoras. And sure enough, I found out that the Rosasco family was still is a major presence up there, but they've been a major ranching family in Sonora, California since the 1850s, the time, yes, indeed, of the Sonora Aero Club. And if you recall, it was Italian ranchers that allowed the Sonora Aero Club members to kind of hide their flying machines out in their barns, kind of like, hangars, I guess. And I have suspected that the Rosascos may have been one of those ranching families that, worked with the Sonora Aero Club and might know some Sonora Aero Club secrets. But here they are with one of their descendants, and arrested on this train in 1915. He's lost his mind. He's 24 years old. He had graduated from, I believe, Berkeley. He was a civil engineering student. He was known to be brilliant. Incredible with math, but he had a bright future ahead of him, and here he is losing his mind on a train in San Bernardino, and he's released into the custody of unidentified friends from Sonora, and he goes back to Sonora, California, back to the family home, and he essentially spends the remaining, I think it's 58 years of his life living on family property. Later in life, he lived with his sisters, but he's living on the family ranch up there in Tuolumne County, and he is obsessively working out mathematical equations, making astronomical observations, and he's doing physical survey of some particular spot on the ranch, and we never learn what that is. We never learn what the product of all this obsession was. We just know that that's what he spent the rest of his life doing. And I got that from a family member who initially talked with me. He had talked with his mother, who was married to Frank's nephew. And so I was talking with Nathan Rosasco, and Nathan, his mom was, I think, in her 90s at that time, because his father had passed away not long before I contacted him. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to talk with the actual nephew of Frank Rosasco, but Nathan's mom totally remembered Uncle Frank, even said to him, yeah, he went down to San Bernardino, lost his mind, and I had learned from the family that, that's what he spent the rest of his years doing. And, as I say in the books, what kind of Lovecraftian horror, haunted this man? First of all, what happened to make him lose his mind? Whose purse was that? Why did they let him go? Go back to the Cora Stanton mystery. When she's found, the newspaper makes it a point to say that no lady's hat, no lady's purse was found, and that goes on until I believe it's the day that Rosasco is arrested on the train, that the newspaper reports that a guy is walking across the field, which by the way, near the lake, at the end of the lake where Cora Stanton was found dead, and he's walking through an area that had already been thoroughly searched, and lo and behold, he finds a lady's purse and a hat and a suicide note. How convenient. And a bottle of bichloride of mercury pills, and the jury very quickly rules, oh, yep, it was a suicide. And of course, when I went to the police station on the outside chance that I could look at the old file, of course, that was a file that, that was destroyed, in some type of flood or fire mishap, real convenient. Anyway, I wanted to see the alleged suicide note, but I was never able to see that. So then we are to assume that the purse that Frank Rosasco is holding, we're to believe, was not this mystery woman, Cora Stanton's. Now, of course, I propose that it's possible that it was intended for Cora Stanton as well as the cash in it, because if I'm right about her having actually been a kind of a well-known historical figure from America's Old West, the late Old West period, and that she might very well have been working in the field for the Secret Service. I go into all the whys, wherefores, and hows of that in the books, okay? I'm not going to belabor that here. But this purse that Frank Rosasco had might have been intended for her as some type of what we call C funds, contingency funds, field money that you need, which then would imply that Rosasco somehow was involved in whatever, she may have been doing. And again, I go into the possibilities of the how and why, because, it's just odd that this guy's got this woman's purse with this money in it when all this is going on, and he's hallucinating a woman, and there's no other woman they're aware of that anything bad has happened to, and then he's released to these guys and on and so forth, and we're never told anything more after the arrest. We're never told anything more about that purse and that money, and then the guy spends the rest of his days obsessively making mathematical calculations, making astronomical observations, and surveying some spot on the property, which, by the way, subsequently to that, Sechery does an analysis, and there's a major intersection of telluric current on a particular spot on the old Rosasco ranch. So Session, I suspect that Frank was aware of this intersection of telluric current, and there was something about that spot. But when you think of mathematics and astronomical observations, your mind takes a turn into Lovecraft country there, because you're wondering, was he under some impression that telluric intersection spot was connected somehow to whatever he was looking at astronomically? And, was the math him trying to calculate when, some window of opportunity of whatever he was looking for? It's just, again, and think about that. Every day for the remaining 58 years of his life. That's what he did. He never really got his mind back enough together to get on with his career. He did not have an engineering career. Remember, he was a graduate in civil engineering, very brilliant mind. And he never married, never had kids. His life was just pretty much, obsessed with something in the stars, something that math was telling him, and something he was surveying, something geophysical on that property. And it has intrigued me and haunted me ever since I first learned about it and, of course, wrote about it. And it's hard to forget. Now, I go in Empire of the Wheel 3, I go into how I think it's possible that Frank Rosasco himself and his story could have been known, subsequently learned about and known to H.P. Lovecraft. I lay this out in the book, how this is very distinctly possible, because Frank Rosasco, when you read his story, he is the classic living embodiment of the typical Lovecraft protagonist. And remember, these stories of Lovecraft that we're talking about, these are all well after 1915. So, Frank Rosasco, his weird, true story predates all of that Lovecraft stuff. And I point out the specific stories in Empire of the Wheel 3. It just makes you wonder, and then you think about, if you've ever read Peter Levenda's book, I think it's called The Dark Lord, the Typhonian Magic book, in which he talks about Crowley in 1908, I think it was, 07, there's that number, 7 or 08, talking about the weird event in which artistic, creative people were somehow telepathically being projected info about this ancient being asleep in a tomb at the bottom of the ocean, and the name of this being was Tutulu, rhyming with Cthulhu, in the story that Lovecraft years later would write. I mean, it's obvious. Levenda points out, and I agree, I reiterated in Empire of the Wheel 3, that it's obvious Lovecraft was familiar with Crowley's writings and was inspired by what Crowley wrote years before, and claims was real, claims was true. Now, was this the kind of thing that Rosasco became obsessed with? Was it some type of Cthulhu or Cthulhu thing? And even more reason to suspect that Lovecraft might have been aware of or learned about the Frank Rosasco story and was inspired, in the creation of multiple protagonists. Now, if you're wondering, why I wonder that, why I propose that is Lovecraft had an associate named Clifford Eddy. Clifford Eddy's wife I discovered through talking with a family member, the grand-nephew of Clifford Eddy's wife. She had lived here in her youth, here in Redlands, California, went to school here and everything, and in just the few years leading up to the Empire of the Wheel mystery, when there was, a lot of spiritualism and a lot of weird stuff going on. So she wasn't here when the Empire of the Wheel events happened. She wasn't here when Rosasco got arrested on the train, but she was here, and they were close to Lovecraft. So, up to, shortly before when the Empire of the Wheel stuff happened, he had a source on the weirdness of this area of the San Bernardino Valley. But then also, he was a correspondent with, oh, jeez. Well, this is so weird, the name. You know what? I gotta go. I gotta go get the name. Hold on. I'm telling you guys, this is just so weird. I apologize for that. I had to walk over to a bookshelf and grab it. Clark Ashton Smith. I want to comment. This forgetting of names and stuff. This stuff, that kind of thing pops up when, I find myself trying to talk about certain aspects of certain things of this mystery where maybe it's because I'm almost 60, but I don't know why that happens. But Clark Ashton Smith was famously a correspondent with Lovecraft. And Smith, grew up and lived not too far from Tuolumne County. And, the news stories of all this stuff about the Empire, what we call the Empire of the Wheel in our books, but the Coruscant mystery and the weird stuff going on in San Bernardino, this stuff was making the newspapers up in Northern California, up in the Bay Area and such. So certainly Clark Ashton Smith, when he was young, could very well have been aware of, the local boy, Frank Rosasco, wonder guy, the brilliant student with the bright future ahead of him. He might very well have been familiar with that story. That might have been something that was known in his community. So between Clifford Eddy's wife, being familiar with general background of the Inland Empire here, the Empire of the Wheel, and Clark Ashton Smith maybe being the one to specifically tell Lovecraft about Frank Rosasco, it's a legitimate suggestion that Rosasco could have inspired the Lovecraft protagonist, the classic Lovecraft protagonist who witnesses something otherworldly, loses his mind, and dives into astronomical sciences, arcane sciences, which math and astronomy, would be applied, possibly. But it was on my mind. This whole thing's on my mind because, again, it has been now 7 years. There's that number, that esoteric number, that period of 7 years since I finished the third book, and since Empire of the Wheel was my primary focus and research, which it had been for that period of 7 years. And, I wonder what might emerge if I were to jump back in and, start taking closer looks. Now, I try every year to go visit Coruscant's gravesite. And, I'll leave a flower on it and stuff. I couldn't go last year for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was I had just shortly before that finished chemotherapy. And, was still kind of low energy in dealing with that. But also, it was in the middle of the COVID restrictions and on and so forth and schedules. I wasn't able to make it to the cemetery last year, but I will be going this year. I go on November 18th and 19th. I go both days usually because by the details, she was likely assaulted and murdered sometime around midnight. So of November 18th, going into the 19th. She was discovered on the 19th dead, so that's the date that's on her gravestone. But I go out, I try to go out every year and visit the gravesite. And if you recall, you've heard me talk about elsewhere, it was a raven that led me to her gravesite in the first place in 2008. That's a whole other story. But the Frank Rosasco thing really continues to intrigue me. There's just so much more there that I don't know yet, and which is fascinating. And I know some folks will say, "Oh wow, man, we got to go out and do some type of ritual on that site." Well, it's private property, so you can't get on there, and it's not owned by the family anymore. So the people that currently own it would probably think you're nuts and not give you access. And you'd have to know the exact spot anyway. I've got it on a map. But again, it is something that nags me. Honestly, I find the Frank Rosasco episode of the Empire of the Wheel mystery to be probably the biggest remaining mystery, other than the whole Cora Stanton thing and who I think she actually was, and why that has remained a secret, for 100 years. Next to that, the Frank Rosasco aspect of this, I think, is the most important. I think is the most potentially shocking and disturbing. Because what if we're talking about something that let's think about what made him lose his mind. Did he simply witness the murder of someone? Would that have made him lose his mind? I guess you have to consider it, but did he see something a little bit more spectacular? Did he see something otherworldly, perhaps? What was he looking for in the stars? What was he looking for in the math, the calculations? What were those calculations? You could say, well, the calculations would tell him when this star is going to be aligned. Oh, okay, yeah, when the stars are aligned, that's a Lovecraftian theme, right? There's the obvious, but was there something else? Was there another factor? Does this have to do with time-space continuum, perhaps? What was he surveying? And how did the calculations and the stars link to whatever it was he was surveying? And if he was indeed surveying the intersection of the telluric currents, did he see it as linked to the stars? Was it some type of portal or doorway into something? Was it a portal through which things that traverse the stars could enter our plane? This is also Jack Parsons type territory, right? But decades before him. It had to have been something so incredible, okay? Far beyond just witnessing a murder, for crying out loud. To shake this brilliant young man to the core, to where, again, 58 years obsessed with these astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and surveying something. It really does inspire you to suspect that he was expecting something to come out of the sky or to come out of that intersection. Check out the story Whisper in Darkness. Check out the movie that the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society did, Whisper in Darkness. And they feature that scene where, the cultists are opening the portal so that the creatures can come through. Now, remember, this was something written years after the Frank Rosasco incident. Did Frank Rosasco's story somehow, whatever Lovecraft learned of it, did that inspire, these kinds of things in his story, where a character opens up, witnesses the opening of a portal? And, I don't know. It looks suspiciously, like that Rosasco is. This is why I talk about this in the third book. But, when I finished that third book and decided I need to get out of the Empire of the Wheel for a while, I went into the Secret Missions series, as you know. Not long after finishing Empire of the Wheel 3, I finished Secret Missions 1, because for the same amount of time that I was researching, the initial Empire of the Wheel investigation, the data for Secret Missions 1 was emerging. And there is some overlap, big time. There's some Hecate overlap, big time, between Juan Cabrillo and the Empire of the Wheel stuff. You guys read the books, But I wanted to take a break from the Empire of the Wheel because it's a very stark, shadowed place to be. Okay, and those 7 years, 2007 to 2014, were rich with, quite frankly, paranormal phenomena witnessed by others. I mean, some of it happened, and I was the only one to witness it, but, somebody walking along the roof at night, my sister and my mom happened to be here, and they heard it. They commented first. They said, "Who is on the roof?" I mean, it was like 10 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night. There's nobody on the roof that was from the house. None of us. Everybody who associated with this house was inside the house. I immediately, stepped out the front door to look. Didn't see anybody. Saw nobody in the backyard. What the hell was that? There was the blood-curdling scream of a woman, which then morphed into the screech of an owl, and that was when I had the owl incident in the tree out in the front yard. And I got photographs of that. I have photographs of that owl. And, subsequent to that, I had a couple of weird owl experiences. I've talked with Mike Cleland about that, and that's just one example. There were wrappings on the walls. There was the raven visitations, and we're not talking blackbirds. I know the difference between a blackbird and a crow and a raven. Okay, these were the real deal. In fact, I even, some of the more recent, because it still happens occasionally, and I have photographs of these things. Okay, that's what's wild. And of course, there was the UFO sighting in December of 2014, which I've talked about elsewhere. A UFO sighting, by the way, that had nothing to do with extraterrestrials. It had a hell of a lot more to do with weird occult stuff, again, linked to Empire of the Whale research. So, what was Frank Rosasco looking for? Was he trying to invoke? Was he trying to draw down? Was he trying to contact? What was he perhaps looking to warn? I don't know. Now, as you guys know, Empire of the Wheel, the rights were bought a couple of years back and is in serious development to be a TV series. Of course, the COVID issue kind of put everybody's stuff on hold last year for several months. There are some things happening. The producer developing it and I are of the same mind. We don't like to talk details until a deal is made and it's really happening, because you can kind of come away embarrassed if you talk all the details of development, because so often these things don't happen. But and if it doesn't, I'll gladly tell you all the details about who has considered this project. It'll surprise you, and who has it right now. And another little tidbit that's going on right now is in the contract phase already, and I'm just kind of champing at the bit to be able to announce that. By the way, all this is going on. You don't, unless you're like a big name famous author. When you're someone on my level, you're not getting rich during development. Okay, I mean, yeah, when someone buys the rights, it's not like they're buying them for $1 million. Believe me, you get paid your little bit, and you got a contract, and you see the person working hard, and she is working amazingly hard on this, and this producer, she has really created an amazing concept for the series. It's going to be a dramatic series, but it's going to dramatically depict the things in the book, including the Frank Rosasco thing I'm talking about. But yes, the development is still going on, and we both, the producer and I, have faith that this thing's going to fly eventually. It's going to happen. It'll happen. But When it does, it's going to be real interesting to see how the Frank Rosasco bit is depicted. But I think about the Rosasco thing, as I said, a lot. I think about the numbers and the karmic frequencies and the numerology of all this. Hecate, the number associated with her, is 100, and often that 100 is broken down to two 50s. She can be venerated in two 50s. For instance, 50 years apart in two sets of 50, so that you equal the 100. That's where Rick and I came up with the suspicion, the concern that there would be more serial killings some type in 2015. And again, it was shocking. I remember that morning, I was still drinking coffee back then, I think. No, I don't recall if I was drinking coffee or green tea, but I remember it was the morning that news story broke, and I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. I contacted Rick. I'm like, can you believe this? It's happening. What we were worried about, what we were concerned about, it's happening, and it's the 100th to the day, 100th anniversary of victim number 6, the 14-year-old girl, Orta Hedges, and 14 people end up dying that day at the hand of at those terrorists, that terrorist couple and their associate. And if you recall, the wife terrorist had posted something in social media dedicating what they were going to do that day to ISIS. Now, ISIS being the terrorist group, but if you do your homework on Hecate, you know that there is a link between Hecate and the Egyptian ISIS. So, there's the terrorist wife, unwittingly, unaware that she's doing this, but essentially, linking a syncretic association to Hecate right there in the act. And, oh yeah, by the way, of course, I pull out the telluric current map and that I'd had for years. By the time this happened, I'd had it for 6 or 7 years, and there on the map, there's an intersection of the telluric current right there on the main corner where the building was, where this terrorist attack happened. So, take it for what it's worth. Don't believe me, whatever you want, but the numbers, Sechery's telluric analysis had years before produced a predictive quality that we were able to be able to say, well, we suspect something's going to happen, 100 associated with Hecate, and it was the 100 years, and that's kind of disturbing. But, I learned that about this karmic frequency stuff that Sesh works out. It does have a strong predictive quality, and that's where it gets scary. That's where I think that's where some people can lose their minds with this stuff, because they don't handle it carefully. Or in some cases, they might grossly misinterpret something, and that can lead to madness too. But, with a lot of folks, if you look too close at the threads in the fabric of reality, it can be difficult to handle, I guess. All sorts of synchronicity becomes apparent. It's not that it wasn't there, but it becomes apparent. And you're seeing it more and more and constantly. It's always there. It's always there. Things are popping up. And, that can kind of push people over the line, again, into a form of madness, which is what I think happened to Frank Rosasco. So, anyway, these are the things I think about in the wee hours of the night. I'm not satisfied with, where I stopped. I've been needing to jump back into this, and I mean, take a real deep dive back into this rabbit hole, as they say. It's inevitable. I knew it would be inevitable. I knew that I would not be able to spend the rest of my life, not going back into this. I just needed a break from it. And the numerology of all this is very interesting, as I pointed out, with the 7s and the 14s and such. So I could go on and on with all this stuff. There's probably some stuff I wanted to ruminate on that I forgot or got distracted from. But there will be, other opportunities to talk about this. I will say this. I know you guys are used to seeing me be Mr. Smiley, Mr. Energy, Mr. Positive, and that's my nature, to be positive. I'll be honest with you. I can only handle a pessimist for so long until I basically tell that pessimist to grow the fuck up. Boo-hoo, life is so bad for you. It's just, the world is just terrible. You're just, you're just in, wah. I can only handle so much of a goddamn pessimist. You gotta pull yourself up sometimes and remember that, your energy affects other people. Anyway, so it's my nature to, I don't try to be Pollyanna-ish, but I do try to, project a positive outlook. And, you guys see me, with, the positive energy, or even when I'm being cantankerous, it's still entertaining, and that's a positive form of energy. But, there is that other side that every once in a while I think I need to introduce them to that side. Those 7 years of investigating and experiencing and discovering, and just through the weird world of the Empire of the Wheel, it brings out the more serious nature, in the personality. And it can be, I liken it to, a homicide detective. After a while, a lot of the guys, they have to get out of that because, what they're seeing so much of. This was a different brand of darkness that, I was seeing and experiencing. And I learned firsthand, that old saying, when you look at it, it notices that you noticed them, and they look back. And in some cases, they, on that edge of our reality, and from, other sides of certain curtains dividing our reality from other realities, when they notice you noticing them, some of them like to have a little fun, letting you know that they're there, and pulling up curtains for you to get glimpses of things. It's hard to resist. Not everybody can resist. And it does affect, as I said, some people's sanity. If you don't have a way of handling fear within yourself, it's, not a good idea to delve too deeply into these things, because I've seen fear lock people up, and not necessarily without good reason. Remember, I'm a field guy, by experience and by nature. Not everybody's a field guy. Some people are scholars, and to them, the idea of the actual manifestation of something that they know through literary pursuits and through scholarship is just a little too much for them. And so they, they're cautious, so they want everybody else to be cautious. And, more than once, my colleagues would say, "Oh my gosh, Walter, don't go do this, don't go do that." And I'd say, "Hey, I'm the field guy here. I'm the one on the ground. It's not as scary as you think. I have a pretty good foundation of protection. And with one of them, I like to joke, you got to die of something. He always hates that when I say that. But anyway, yeah. So the Frank Rosasco thing, the numerology of all this, there's so much that I didn't go into in the books that I could go on and talk about, which I will as I do future episodes like this, where I just want to get on here, turn on the microphone, and just go. I think there's some of you that want to hear this, and more of you that interested in Empire of the Wheel stuff, or maybe you're not familiar with my Empire of the Wheel work yet. And you kind of need to hear this. You need to know. It has taken me years to be more open about what I and my associates went through and experienced during the Empire of the Whale investigation years. Okay, I mean, this was, there was weird stuff going on big time, but the books were not about me and that we were going through. Okay, the books were about those original 7 victims in the 1915 mystery, and everything that seemed to be connected to that. That's what the books were about. I'm kind of iffy on this journalism of include yourself as part of the story. There's a thread of that seems just a little too narcissistic and such that I don't know. I'd rather share this with you guys talking about it than, you notice the one book I wrote about my own experiences is I think the thinnest or shortest book I've ever written. And it's not because there's nothing there. It's because as rich as my history with that is, and as long as I've encountered weird things, when it comes to, here's my story, it's to writing it, it's just really weird. I have this reticence to want to, lay it all down. It seems pretentious because, a lot of experiences you have, they're intended for you. And, we've got this culture where it's like share everything, we want to relate. We want to relate to other people. We want to know that we're not alone. And I'm just not one of those people. I'm not obsessed with relating to others. I'm perfectly fine, not necessarily relating to a bunch of people. But anyway, that's another discussion. So anyway, there's a bunch of crap for you to think about. And I know I'll get on here and talk about Frank Rosasco again, because I'm going to be diving into the Frank Rosasco mystery. I'm going to be diving back into the Empire of the Wheel in general. There's aspects of the research that are in a private journal that I was keeping all these years that did not make it into the books. Or there was just a little touch or a mention, like constellations of street names that, are synchronicitous to all this, and other strange things. Again, the things that didn't necessarily make it into the books are things that I could share with you in these talks. So anyway, it's very late. And I should probably stop this and get some sleep. This is a Saturday night, so tomorrow I have the live stream. And that's that. So I think I will end this for now. And whenever you're listening to this, enjoy your day or have a good night or whatever. And there will be more. I'll get back on here and, pick this up sooner than you think. So I'll talk at you later.